For those who aren't familiar, the Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict was established in 2001. It's a global network of...
My name is Oscar Bolanos.
Is now joining.
Okay, we're going to continue.
Toby Burns with NHK.
Is now exiting.
Okay. The Watchlist is a global network of 13 human rights and humanitarian organizations that work together to uphold the rights of children in the context of armed conflict. Since 2017,
Unknown participant is now joining.
Each year, the Watchlist has published an annual policy note with recommendations for the Secretary General on parties to armed conflict that should be included in the annexes to his annual report to the Security Council on Children in Armed Conflict. We know that the SG is currently preparing his report, which is expected in June, and Watchlist is calling on him to publish a complete and accurate list of perpetrators based on the evidence that is collected by the UN's monitoring and reporting mechanism on children in armed conflict. So today, the Watchlist is going to present its report and the importance of holding all warring parties accountable to the same standard. And members of the Watchlist network are also going to be highlighting some of the country-specific findings. We're also launching a new fact sheet on COVID-19 and its impact on children affected by armed conflict. We know that on the one hand, while children have largely been spared from the impact of the pandemic, at least from the direct effects of the virus, the pandemic is having far-reaching impacts on their rights and well-being. And this is certainly more the case in war-torn countries where conflict has decimated public health and protection systems, curtailed access to clean water, and left children in a position where they're least able to follow basic prevention strategies. So we have 4 speakers this morning. We'll hear from each of them briefly and then open things up to questions. So let me give you an overview of our panel, and then I'll introduce each speaker before they take the floor. The panel includes Adrienne Lepar, who's the program director for the Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict, Sarah Kayali, who is the Syria researcher for Human Rights Watch, Lindsay Hutchinson, the policy and advocacy advisor on peace and security at Plan International, and Lindsay Hawken, the senior humanitarian policy advisor and representative to the UN for World Vision International. So Adrienne is going to start us off. As I mentioned, she's the program director for the Watchlist. She oversees our advocacy with the United Nations, its research on children's rights and armed conflict, and our partnerships with local civil society organizations. She's going to present the main findings of our new report, including our methodology, and explain why the Secretary General's annual list of shame is so important for protecting children in armed conflict. So, Adrienne.
Joe, Lou here. Before Adrienne starts, can I just say a quick word of thanks to the UN Correspondents Association for organizing it. Want to welcome, this is our first UN Correspondents Association virtual press conference. It's a bit of an experiment. We hope to continue doing these kinds of press conferences going forward. We don't want to sort of miss any beats in what we're doing. So without further ado, we welcome members of UNCA, and we look forward to doing more of this. And if you have any feedback on how this went, don't hesitate to send it to us afterwards. Anyways, back over to you, Joe and Adrienne.
Okay. Adrienne, go ahead.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks, Lou. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. So as Joe mentioned, Secretary General Antonio Guterres is currently preparing his annual report on children in armed conflict, whose annexes include a list of parties to conflict that have committed grave violations against children. The Secretary General's list of perpetrators has often been referred to as a list of shame. Why? Because when parties are included on a list, they are stigmatized. Nobody wants to be on this list. That creates a real incentive for parties to do what it takes to get off the list. The listing opens up a dialogue between the party and the UN. UN country teams are mandated by the Security Council to engage with listed parties to end and prevent violations. This allows the UN to secure concrete changes in behavior, not just by listed government forces, but also by non-state armed groups. To date, the UN has signed 32 action plans with listed parties, including 12 government forces and 20 non-state armed groups. Of those, 12 parties have fully complied with their commitments and were subsequently delisted. In recent years, however, perpetrators have evaded inclusion on the Secretary General's list of shame, despite the UN's findings that they had committed grave violations. We believe this threatens to undermine the list's credibility and weaken its strength as a tool for promoting accountability and compliance with international law. All perpetrators of grave violations need to be held to the same standard, regardless of who they or their friends are, regardless of whether they're government security forces, international coalitions, regional forces, non-state armed groups, or even UN peacekeepers. Parties should be included in the Secretary General's list for one reason alone: documented UN-verified evidence that they committed grave violations against children in situations of armed conflict. With this report, Watchlist makes two key recommendations to the Secretary General. First, he should publish a credible, accurate list of child rights violators in his upcoming annual report. Secondly, Watchlist recommends a rigorous due diligence process by the Secretary General to ensure that his list is evidence-based, accurately reflecting data collected and verified by the UN's monitoring and reporting mechanism. I'm going to speak briefly about the methodology that Watchlist used to reach its country-specific recommendations in this report. So Watchlist, we conducted a systematic desk review of various publicly available reports across 16 relevant country situations for the period from January 1st to December 31st, 2019. Sources included the Secretary General's previous annual reports on children in armed conflict, reports from UN agencies and offices, peacekeeping and special political missions, treaty bodies and commissions of inquiry, as well as documentation by credible international NGOs with relevant expertise. In some cases, we also analyzed credible news media sources in connection with the other sources I mentioned. Our review focused on the 5 violations that trigger listing in the Secretary General's annual reports. Those are recruitment and use of children, killing and maiming of children, rape and other forms of sexual violence against boys and girls, attacks on schools and hospitals, and abductions of children. For our analysis, we reviewed the Secretary General's annexes from 2015 to 2019 and determined a minimum number of verified cases that triggered new listings for each violation. This in turn helped us come up with a simple threshold based on the minimum number of cases used to trigger first-time listing of a given party. For example, a minimum number of 9 verified cases of attacks on schools and hospitals. It's important to note that the information in our policy note is not comprehensive, nor is it intended to serve as a complete list of all incidents perpetrated against children in 2019. Nevertheless, based on publicly available sources, our research allowed us to formulate the following 3 key recommendations. First, where we found sufficient evidence that parties had committed grave violations in 2019, we recommend that the Secretary General include 6 government or coalition forces and 2 armed groups in his annual list of child rights violators.
Unknown participant is now joining.
Second, where information from the Secretary General's 2019 annual report raises concern for the protection of children, but the information available was insufficient, we have recommended that the UN further investigate to determine whether they should be listed in the 2020 report. And third, where parties have been known to commit grave violations against children in recent years, but have not been addressed in the Secretary General's annual reports, we recommend that the Secretary General include information on the situation of children in these countries, namely Cameroon, the Sahel, and Ukraine. As I mentioned, our report covers grave violations against children in 14 countries. I'm going to highlight just a few examples, and then, of course, as Joe mentioned, other panelists will go into some of the other situations as well. In Afghanistan, US-led international forces killed and maimed at least 759 children between 2015 and 2019, with the number of UN-verified child casualties steadily rising each year, from 55 in 2015 to 286 in 2018. According to UNAMA's 2019 annual report on the protection of civilians in Afghanistan, Airstrikes by international forces were responsible for approximately 235 child casualties last year. Yet the Secretary General failed to list them for killing and maiming. In Yemen, the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition has continued to attack schools and hospitals, denying children's rights to education and health. In 2018, Secretary General Guterres removed the coalition from his list of shame for attacks on schools and hospitals, despite the UN's own findings that it continued to commit this violation. In fact, the year that it was delisted, the coalition was found responsible for 19 out of 20 UN-verified attacks on schools, and 5 out of 11 UN-verified attacks on hospitals. In 2018, the UN found that the coalition had committed 15 attacks on schools and hospitals, the same number of that particular violation attributed to the Houthis. And in 2019, as our report shows, attacks on schools and hospitals also continued at the hand of the coalition. According to the UN's criteria for delisting from the Secretary General's annual list, a party is required to sign and implement an action plan with the UN and go a full year without committing the said violation. For this reason, Watchlist believes the coalition was prematurely delisted and should be put back on the Secretary General's list until it has fully met the necessary criteria. In the same vein, we urge the Secretary General and his Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict to ensure that parties sign and fully implement action plans to end and prevent violations, and that they completely cease those violations before they are removed from the list. In closing, no party wants to be included on the Secretary General's list of shame. It is an effective tool for incentivizing changes in behavior, namely the signing and implementation of concrete time-bound action plans to end and prevent grave violations against children. Secretary General Guterres should protect the credibility and integrity of this tool and ensure a complete, accurate list of perpetrators in his annual report on children in armed conflict. And this list should be grounded in facts, not politics. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Adrian. As Adrian outlined, one of the key recommendations from Watchlist's report is that the Secretary General should add Russian government forces to his list for attacks on children in Syria. So next we're going to hear from Sarah Kayali, who is the Syria researcher at Human Rights Watch, which is one of the founding members of the Watchlist. So she's going to speak about Human Rights Watch's research on the role of Russian government forces and Russian-backed Syrian air forces for violations against children in Syria. Sarah?
Thanks very much, Joe. Glad to be here, even virtually. So I'll start maybe very briefly by saying that the Russian Air Force has been part of the military alliance with Syrian government forces since September 2015. And even before that, they used to provide weapons to the Syrian government as well as political cover in order to support the Syrian government in the Syrian conflict. But since 2015, they took on a more expansive military role, lending not just their air force, but some of their top commanders, as well as continued provision of munition until currently, when the Syrian-Russian military alliance is still in operation in the northwest. Since Russia has joined the military alliance, over 5,000 children have been killed, according to UNICEF, and 40% of schools have been damaged or destroyed in the course of around 4 years, between 2015 and 2019. The Russian Air Force has supported the Syrian government in conducting indiscriminate strikes, but also attacks with prohibited weapons, including cluster munitions that it itself provided to Syrian government forces in conducting attacks in the past 5 years. Up until 2019, Russia has consistently denied its involvement in attacks or strikes that we or others have documented, claiming either that they had not conducted this attack, that there were terrorists there that justified the attack, or that the Syrian government had conducted this attack without their knowledge or support. And it was very difficult for us and other organizations to actually prove that Russia had direct involvement. Under international law, Russia is jointly liable for any war crime or human rights violation or violation of IHL that is being committed as part of the military alliance. However, continued denials by Russia and the inability to really pinpoint an attack on them meant that, at least politically, there wasn't much will available to hold them accountable. In 2019, things changed slightly. Attacks that Human Rights Watch had investigated in the course of the Syrian-Russian military offensive on Idlib was an attack on a displacement center in Idlib that killed 20 civilians, the majority of whom were women and children. And we claimed that it was, we found that the strike amounted to a war crime. A few months later, the New York Times received leaked recordings that for the first time proved, alongside witness testimony and video footage, that actually the Russian Air Force was directly responsible for this attack on the displacement camp. This was followed by the UN Commission of Inquiry itself, confirming direct Russian involvement in attacks in Idlib for the first time in 2019 in a report that they published on March 2020. So we were finally able to have a direct link between the Russian Air Force to attacks being conducted in Idlib that are still being conducted until this day. And being able to do that, the next step in Human Rights Watch's efforts, but also in other organizations' efforts, is to make sure that Russian government forces are held accountable both jointly as part of the military alliance and independently, given their direct involvement. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Next, we're going to move to Lindsay Hutchinson. As Adrian mentioned, one of the recommendations from Watchlist is that several countries be added to the narrative of the Secretary General's report, including Cameroon. So Lindsay is the Policy and Advocacy Advisor on Peace and Security at Plan International, a global humanitarian organization, which is also part of Watchlist. And she's going to be speaking specifically on the situation of children in Northwest and Southwest Cameroon, where Plan is running programs to support children affected by the conflict. Lindsay?
Thanks, Joe. So in the conflict in Northwest and Southwest Cameroon, children are being killed and maimed and raped and abducted, and their schools and hospitals are often occupied and attacked. The suffering of children in the conflict in this region has gone unrecognized thus far by the United Nations Secretary General in his annual reports on children in armed conflict. It's imperative for the Secretary General this year in his report to include Cameroon as a situation of concern. At the end of 2019, the year that the SG's upcoming report covers, 700,000 Cameroonians were displaced inside the country as IDPs, and 52,000 have already fled to Nigeria. 1.3 million people have been affected by the crisis, and still are. The crisis in Cameroon's Anglophone region between the non-state armed groups and government security forces have resulted in ongoing dynamic displacement. Clashes between armed actors are the main reason and cause of this displacement and the killing of civilians. Plan International has worked in Northwest Cameroon since 1996, and we know the area well. It's horrifying what's happening to children in this conflict. We are neutral as a humanitarian organization and strictly abide by the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Humanitarian work in the region has been very challenging due to the ongoing clashes, including denial of humanitarian access, lockdowns, and other obstructions of humanitarian aid. Aid workers have been detained, kidnapped, and killed in 2019. Parties must allow humanitarian work to reach the children of Cameroon. The Watchlist Credible List report details protection risks for children in 2019 reported by OCHA, including attacks on schools and hospitals, sexual exploitation and abuse, gender-based violence, forced recruitment by armed forces or armed groups, arbitrary arrest, and early marriage. Children, as usual, are the most affected and most vulnerable by this crisis. Among these violations, I would like to highlight the following. Children are being killed in the crossfire by gunshots, by the torching of their homes, in clashes and raids. They are dying and being maimed both in their villages and while on the move. And this is a conflict that is constantly on the move. Children have been prevented also from attending school for the past 3 years now as a political tactic. At the end of 2019, more than 855,000 children remained out of school in the Northwest and Southwest regions. 90% of primary schools and 77% of secondary schools remain closed. Children have even been abducted attempting to attend school, stopped because of wearing a school uniform or carrying a book. Watchlist highlighted an incident in their report from February 2019, where 170 students were abducted, mostly girls under the age of 18, along with a teacher and 2 guards from a boarding school in the Northwest region. Schools have also been used as bases, despite Cameroon having signed the Safe Schools Declaration in 2018. On recruitment, we have heard that adolescent males are particularly targeted for potential recruitment and are also often arbitrarily suspected to be a part of armed groups. According to OCHA, child protection actors reported an increase in the number of adolescent boys also leaving armed groups as well, which indicates that they originally were in the armed group. They also documented several cases of arbitrary arrest and detention targeting adolescent boys suspected of having links with the non-state actors. There are limited resources for humanitarian actors to support these children. Due to the limited capacity, partners only carry out limited life-saving services in our humanitarian efforts. If this situation were more properly reflected by being included in the SSG's report, it would assist in increasing the UN and humanitarian community's ability to greater support children's reintegration in this conflict as well. Lastly, on sexual violence. Children have been victims of sexual violence by both sides of this conflict. The unknown cases are likely much higher as survivors and caregivers do not want to speak of the abuse because there is an element of risk and fear of stigma. We know also that girls are more exposed than boys to sexual violence in the conflict in Cameroon, and girls as young as 7 years old have been raped. Kidnapping, detention, and rape have been reported to protection actors, with girls as the primary targets, and additionally, because of the conflict and the existing instability now in their communities, children are exposed to additional predatory behavior. Community fear around reporting and seeking support after GBV remains a key obstacle for us in providing support, which is compounded by these humanitarian access issues I mentioned, as Plan International trained social workers are often from the urban centers and are unable to safely access the most affected areas and provide counseling and case management support. To conclude, in 2019, children in Cameroon have been killed, burnt, raped, abducted, and made extremely vulnerable in this conflict. The international community must wake up and realize the gravity of the situation facing children in the northwest and southwest of Cameroon. Secretary General Guterres has the information and the ability to make this happen and shine a desperately needed light on the situation of children in northwest, southwest Cameroon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. We're going to turn now to our last speaker, another Lindsay Hawken, who's the Senior Humanitarian Policy Advisor and Representative to the United Nations for World Vision International, another member of the Watchlist network. Lindsay is part of the team leading World Vision's global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And as I mentioned, Watchlist is also today releasing a new fact sheet on COVID-19's impact on children in armed conflict. So Lindsay is going to speak to those issues. Lindsay?
Thank you, Jo. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. As an advisory board member to Watchlist and as a humanitarian and development organization responding to COVID-19, World Vision is pleased to support Watchlist release of its fact sheet that puts the focus of the risks of this virus on children living in armed conflict specifically. Countries and populations affected by conflict are the least able to respond. In Central African Republic, for example, 2.2 million people were already in need of emergency health assistance. Now with confirmed cases, the country has only a handful of ventilators for a population of 5 million. Displaced populations are among the least able to implement the most basic prevention measures. In Cox's Bazar, for example, camp structures make it almost impossible for Rohingya refugees to physically distance, and limitations on internet connectivity severely impacts the ability of aid organizations to remotely disseminate COVID-19 information. This pandemic may not currently be perceived as a major threat to children, as Joe suggested and when we started off, but we know that the indirect and the secondary effects of a viral epidemic can be just as devastating, particularly for children. Too many children, especially those living in conflict, already face unacceptable threats to their well-being and safety. World Vision's experience during the 2014 to 2016 Ebola outbreak in West Africa helps us to project that beyond COVID-19 itself, children will inevitably face heightened food insecurity, increased risk of violence, and the interruption or total breakdown of essential services. While children may not suffer the worst symptoms of COVID-19 itself, millions will be out at risk due to weak healthcare systems, being overwhelmed and unable to maintain routine immunization schedules and other forms of primary healthcare. Specific protection concerns are emerging for girls and boys as a knock-on effect of the pandemic as well. Families are already living on the brink when they're in a situation of armed conflict. Where COVID-19 causes the further loss of livelihood or income, negative coping mechanisms are typically adopted, and that increases protection risks as well. Child marriage for adolescent girls increases as dowry economies reframe girls as a form of family income generation that no one wants. Child protection actors have already shared reports of increased violence in the home. Married or partnered adolescent girls are facing heightened risk of intimate partner violence, with movement restrictions limiting opportunities to access support or alternative shelter. Watchlist fact sheet on COVID-19 throws a spotlight on the possible impacts specifically with respect to grave violations of children's rights, highlighting the increased risk for these to occur. For example, school closures have taken place globally, but it is in situations of armed conflict where the risk of military occupation of education facilities increases dramatically. Measures aimed at limiting the public transmission of COVID-19, including movement and public gathering restrictions, have posed significant challenges for humanitarian actors to access affected populations and to continue our operations. Over 100 million people globally were already dependent on humanitarian assistance before COVID-19 took hold. Some governments have taken positive steps to identify humanitarian operations as essential and allow movement exceptions, while in other countries, significant interruptions are experienced, resulting indirectly and perhaps unintentionally in the denial of humanitarian assistance to children. Essential humanitarian operations have understandably prioritized health, water and hygiene, and food assistance, but may not include child protection as an essential aspect. In Syria, 450 child-friendly spaces and women and girls safe spaces have been temporarily closed, leaving thousands with interruptions to their psychosocial support and access to other critical services. Despite heightened risks for girls and boys in this situation, the capacity of humanitarian actors to provide child protection services consequently faces limitations. The implications of COVID-19 also poses constraints on accountability mechanisms integral to preventing and reducing grave violations of children's rights. Access challenges and impacts to peacekeeping operations that we've heard of from the Secretary General risk lowering capacity to implement the monitoring and reporting mechanism for children armed conflict and respond to grave violations of children's rights. Responding to COVID-19 in a manner that prioritizes response in both direct and secondary impacts is essential for children in situations of armed conflict. Alongside our peers, such as PRAN, World Vision is responding in 65 countries with specific focus on supporting at least 22.5 million people in 28 countries, particularly those experiencing armed conflict and the greatest vulnerability. Our response tackles COVID-19 directly through preparedness, prevention, and support to health systems, but equally the indirect impacts for children, strengthening their protective environment. There are a number of actions that we can take to safeguard children's rights. Together with Watchlist and drawing on World Vision's experience from our field operations implementing response to date, we've captured some of these points in a policy brief to be released today on child protection and COVID-19. Some of the most critical actions include the facilitation of access for all frontline health and humanitarian workers by governments, ensuring safety and duty of care measures are in place. Personnel classes essential should include those responsible for monitoring, reporting, and responding to grave violations of children's rights, and ensuring the continuity of humanitarian child protection services. Recognizing the risk to children's rights this pandemic poses, donor governments should ensure that 4% of total humanitarian assistance is allocated to child protection. Related, governments and the UN should consider the potential risk of military occupation of schools in light of closures and put in place measures to protect education facilities in part with these resources. Finally, governments should ensure continued compliance with international laws, particularly respect for non-derogable human rights and non-refoulement. The UN and civil society actors should continue to rigorously monitor and report on grave violations, as well as other child protection concerns. Reflections following epidemic outbreaks such as Ebola in West Africa highlighted how health response alone is absolutely not enough, and how the devastating indirect and secondary impacts can make children hidden victims. For girls and boys living in situations of armed conflict, the risks are even greater, and the need to safeguard their rights is even more essential. As we welcome the calls and acts around the world for global solidarity in the fight against global COVID-19, we hope you will join us in ensuring that children in armed conflict are prioritized and not forgotten. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. We're now going to open things up to questions. And as Lou indicated earlier on, this online format is an experiment for us. So we'd like to ask people, if you have a question, to give your name and your media outlet in the chat, and we can call on you there. And we will be giving priority to UNCA members. So I think everyone is currently muted. So if I recognize you, you'll have to unmute yourself. Does anyone have questions?
So far, I have nothing on the chat.
That's because the chat is muted. You can't put it in.
You can.
Okay.
Hold on. Let me try that then.
Well, Edie, if you have a question, do you want to kick things off?
Sure.
Great. Go ahead, Edie.
What makes any of you think that the Secretary General, particularly at this time, would actually go and name the United States forces in Afghanistan or Russia, or put Saudi Arabia back on a consolidated list? What would have changed from last year that would make him change his past practice?
Thanks. Great question, Edie. Adrian, do you want to take that?
Sure. Thanks, Edie. Well, I mean, as I mentioned, Watchlist has long been advocating on the Children in Armed Conflict agenda and upholding the integrity of these mechanisms. This moment, when the world is responding to the COVID-19 global pandemic, is no reason to let down our guard and ignore grave violations against children. And as Lindsay highlighted, in fact, Lindsay Hawken from World Vision highlighting the impact of the pandemic on children's rights, it's all more of the reason that we should uphold the protection of international laws. So Watchlist has continued its advocacy on this throughout the year. As you know, we've published this policy brief each year ahead of the publication of the SG's report. This is the 4th year that we've published this report, but throughout the year we've also continued our advocacy with the SG's office, as well as with the Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, continuing to share information with them about grave violations against children in several of the country situations that you mentioned and that are highlighted in our report. And we will continue to press them because we believe that So we firmly believe that these mechanisms are an effective way to end and prevent such violations.
And if I could just add, I mean, I think, Edie, you've put your finger on a really important issue here, is that, over the last few years, we've really seen powerful governments let off the hook. And one of the reasons why we're, holding this press conference and releasing our policy note in advance of the SG's report is to really pressure him to be, even-handed in listing everyone who has committed grave violations. And certainly we welcome your participation today, because media attention to these gaps in the past will certainly help create more pressure on him to do the right thing this year and provide a comprehensive list. We have a question from Matthew Lee, Inner City Press.
Let me see if I'm unmuted. Does that work?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thanks a lot. I wanted to ask you about, I noticed that you put in the report the situation in Cameroon. I think that's all to the good. But I wanted to, you seem to focus, I wanted to ask about this more recent attack in February 2020 in Nagar or Nagarbu in northwest region of Cameroon. It seems like at least 13 children were killed. Seems almost incontrovertible that the government is behind it. And I wonder if you think that the UN has done enough to make sure that the facts are released. The Secretary General had said that or taken credit for a ceasefire there. And at least from what I'm hearing, there's no ceasefire at all. There's still people, largely by the government, being killed. So I wonder, I understand that you're making a call that he included in the report. Do you think there's any chance of that? And how do you actually assess the Secretary General's performance on Cameroon these last 3 years? Thanks.
Thanks for the question. Just to note that the SG's report is going to be focused on violations that took place in the calendar year 2019. But thanks for drawing our attention to this 2020 attack. Lindsay, since you spoke to the situation in Cameroon, are you able to respond to the question?
Yeah, I can respond to some of it. My colleague Adrian from Watchlist would be better suited to respond to your question regarding the incident in 2020. So for 2019, we know that all of the grave violations against children have taken place in Cameroon. The Secretary General knows it, and many of the UN agencies operating both inside Cameroon and from the New York headquarters also know and have that information. It's gotten to a point now where it would be highly problematic if the Secretary General weren't to include this information in this upcoming report. It's no secret anymore. The situation's very bad. It should not be political. The only way for the conflict to stop hurting children is for the UN and the Secretary General to include it and start addressing it so that the UN can address it as a global body full of the member states that have the power to improve their life. Adrian,
thanks, Lindsay. Adrian, do you want to add anything?
Just to add that, Matthew, while I'm not going to comment specifically on the February 2020 incident, which we also noted with serious concern, but as Joe mentioned, we're focusing on incidents in 2019 for this report. But in terms of, you mentioned that there were allegations of both sides being involved in different incidents, and that's precisely why it would be really important for the situation to be included in the Secretary General's report. This would increase focus on monitoring and reporting, which is already happening by UN actors on the ground, but by including the situation in his general report, that would lead to the funneling of additional resources towards monitoring and reporting, which would allow the UN to be able to attribute incidents to particular actors. And as we said, that's important for accountability and then leading to concrete actions to end those violations from particular actors. Thanks.
Thanks, Adrian. The chat function should be functioning, but we have no one waiting in the chat. If someone simply wants to unmute and ask a question, that's also perfectly fine.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Ibtisam Azam from Al Arabi Jadid newspaper. And the chat, I mean, on my side, actually, it's not working.
Okay.
But so my question is regarding the claims of Mr. Guterres that he's not including U.S. government, Afghani government, Saudis, or the Israeli government, because he's doing behind doors diplomacy. What would you say against such an argument, and which trends do you see in the last 2 years that contradict his claims? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Adrian, do you want to take that?
Sure. Thanks. Well, I mean, there are different actors within the UN system who are, of course, involved in advocacy, both publicly and privately, with actors involved in armed conflict to end attacks against civilians and specifically grave violations against children. And the Secretary General and his Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict have a particular role to speak publicly out against such violations. We understand limitations of humanitarian actors, for example, who are operational on the ground and who may need to do behind closed doors advocacy to protect their operations on the ground. But the Secretary General, in the position that he holds, is in a particular position where he can speak publicly and denounce such violations. And this mechanism of the annual report, and specifically of the list of shame, is a tool that, as we've seen, even by the fact that parties to conflict and their allies have put pressure on the SG in the past, as well as previous Secretary Generals. That's, I think, proof that nobody wants to be on that list, and that it's a tool for putting pressure on them to end grave violations.
If I can just add something to that, I mean, the fact of the matter is that the report and the list in the annex is really meant to be based on facts. Whether the SG is conducting behind the scenes diplomacy or not should have no bearing on who is listed or what is reported. That really comes from the violations that have been documented by the MRM on the ground. So of course we welcome any diplomacy by the Secretary General to urge a cessation or an ending of these violations against children, but we still, at the end of the day, expect a fact-based report and list. We have another question here from Valeria Robecho from ANSA. Valeria?
Okay, yes, thank you, and thank you for the virtual press conference. What do you think about the list of the shame being divided up into parties trying to improve and others? I mean, has it improved things? Thanks.
I'm so glad you asked that question. So as for maybe just a little bit of background for others, in case you're not familiar, that in 2017, Secretary General Guterres, in his first annual report on children in armed conflict as Secretary General, he started to divide the annexes between sections A and B, parties to conflict that had supposedly put in place measures to protect children, and those that had not. Something that some actors have dubbed a good killers list and a bad killers list. For us, at the end of the day, these are all parties to conflict that have violated children's rights in armed conflict. There should be no distinction. And furthermore, in our report and in our previous advocacy and ongoing advocacy with the Secretary General, we've urged him to return to a single list and to put in place to make clear what are the criteria that he is saying that parties have put in place measures. As I mentioned in my presentation about the Saudi-led coalition, we've continued to see attacks that have resulted in child casualties. We've continued to see attacks on schools and hospitals. So while the coalition has, done different measures to supposedly reduce violations, we're not actually seeing the positive impact for children on the ground. So simply putting in supposed measures is not the measure, but rather what this looks like for children on the ground. And as we've said, for delisting, parties should fully implement an action plan with the UN and completely end all violations. And this is something that the UN itself has previously specified, that it should go a full year without any violations before being delisted.
Thanks, Adrian. So as we noted, the chat is working for some people, but not others. So if you're not able to access the chat, please just feel free to unmute and ask a question. Okay, if there are no further questions, we'll conclude the press conference. Again, I want to thank
I'm back.
Oh, sorry, did you have a question?
Is now exiting.
Okay. So I wanted to thank the UN Correspondents Association for hosting this online press conference, and to everyone for participating. If you have follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to email Adrian with follow-ups. And hopefully you have the full report and the fact sheet available to you. Again, if for some reason you don't have it, reach out to Adrian. And thank you again for participating. We'll see you another time.